Hello there, dear listeners and viewers, and welcome to this podcast episode of Interesting Conversations with Mislav Jurić. And today we have a guest, which is Steve Omohundro. And Steve, I will let you introduce yourself because you have a lot of impressive accomplishments on your list of accomplishments. So I don't want to do you injustice by omitting some of those.
Oh, I won't go through all of that, but I can tell you basically, I'm a researcher in artificial intelligence. I got my PhD in physics in 1985, and right after I finished, I had a friend that had started a company called Thinking Machines, which was an AI company back then. He recruited me, and I switched to that field, and the rest is history. Done a lot of work in machine learning and in various applied areas, grammar learning, built a system to read lips. I've been with a bunch of startup companies and with research labs. And about 20 years ago, I started getting very interested in the social implications of AI and how is it going to change human society and how do we ensure that it's beneficial, and did a lot of talks and papers and things on that area. And now I'm working sort of on both dimensions, very interested in sort of the more near term, how can businesses use AI to increase business value? And then how do we sort of guide things so that it's good for individuals?
Awesome. So I want to just throw the focus back on the some of the things earlier in your career that you said you worked on. From what I read on your website and on other places on the internet, it said that you worked with a lot of startups. So is this the thing you mentioned, that you kind of focus on the businesses that can actually use AI to improve those business results? Could you maybe go a little bit deeper into that? What do you do with startups and with businesses?
Well, I mean, I've always sort of, I came out of academia, and I was a professor at the University of Illinois for a couple of years. And but this area is so, like right now, probably the bulk of funding for AI is coming from companies. And so it's sort of halfway between academic and corporate. And the research labs I was involved with, I was at NEC, a big Japanese company, for a number of years out in Princeton. And so I've sort of crossed on both sides of that. And I see huge potential right now. It's interesting. AI is moving very, very quickly at the moment. And investment is getting huge as people see the real potential for application. But most companies are only using it in very simple ways at the moment. And so I think the revolution is still pretty much ahead of us. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for new companies. One I've been fascinated by that's actually been in the news quite a lot recently is TikTok, which until recently at least has been the parent company of that is a company called ByteDance. And it's the most valuable startup in the world. It was valued privately, before all the issues around, China and so on. It was valued at $140 billion. And that company is based on a pretty simple app. It's short form videos, and they have a recommender engine, which depending on exactly how fast you scroll and what you like, it shows you more videos it thinks you'll like, and it's really, really good at that. And so it has just exploded virally in every market that it has entered. And so out of a pretty simple, and they have a few other things. They help you lip sync, and they've got tools to add visual effects, simple little AI applications. And pretty much that's what drove $140 billion worth of value. And so that's remarkable. Microsoft, Oracle, and Walmart, I just read this morning, are battling one another to buy that, probably for less than 140, more like 30 or $50 billion. But still, pretty amazing that simple AI algorithms can create enormous social value and economic value.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about TikTok because I'm actually using it. In fact, like as I started building up my personal website, I started using TikTok and post like funny programming videos. And so yeah, I've seen its capabilities. It's actually pretty remarkable. And the first app I noticed this on was Snapchat, actually, where you can just kind of point your phone and you actually see your face changed. And so to me, this was like pretty interesting because I saw like the power of the AI, what it can do.
Yeah, in both those cases, it's much more immediate than competitors. That you immediately see what you're doing. With TikTok, you don't like a video, you just scroll and you got the next one. You don't have to look through lists and check off, oh, I'm interested in, sports and this and that. TikTok does all of that behind the scenes, and it engages you in a new and unusual way. And so I think there are many, many, many opportunities like that. Like you say in Snapchat, the real-time feedback. Imagine you could create your own videos. Say you're doing videos about AI. Imagine the tools to create graphics and to have sound effects and to have music. All of those were as immediate as the kind of thing you experienced with Snapchat, but it would totally transform your video creation. And so I think we're going to see that in every area of human engagement, and it's going to be remarkable.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that I can't even think about what it's going to look like in about 5 years. It's too hard for me, because if somebody told me like when I was a teenager that Snapchat is going to exist with all of its capabilities, I'd be like, okay, maybe it's possible, but I don't know. I'd be pessimistic about it.
Yeah. The thing I'm really excited about now, I'm writing some papers. I given a couple of talks. Is something I call personal AI. There's a guy named Yuval Harari who wrote the book Sapiens. I don't know if you read that. Really good book about the sort of history of humanity. And he's been thinking about what's the implication of AI. And he recently gave a graduation speech to students graduating this year. And instead of giving advice, which is the sort of usual thing for that, he posed a challenge. He said that AI is getting powerful so quickly that governments and companies will use this AI to model people and use those models to manipulate them. And so I think the title of his talk was The Rise of the Hackable Animal, something like that. And so he was challenging the students to find a way to counteract this so that we don't just become sort of, victims in some sense of powerful AI. And so my solution to that is something I'm calling personal AI, which is I think every individual will have their own AI that knows their values, beliefs, and desires and can represent them in interacting with corporate AI, with government AI, with social networks, to represent their interests out there in the world. And I think that will dramatically change the power relationships in the world. And so I'm actually very optimistic by the individual empowerment that AI could potentially bring, probably in the next 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, as you mentioned it, I participated this year, although it was remote. I was supposed to go to Canada to an AI safety research camp, and it was remote this year. But we had a video game over Zoom. That is, it was like a video game. We were over video, but it was essentially like a board game over video. So what we did was we played a game where each of the players was either a company or a country, and we could research stuff, or we could upgrade some research capabilities or various other actions. And in the end of the game, there's actually two ways for the game to end. You can either develop an AGI, or you can develop AI capabilities that empower every single human being, and then the AGI necessity sort of disappears because everybody already has this personal AI assistant, and people don't really kind of pursue AGI anymore because it's deemed too risky. So a thought just popped into my head. Do you think that something like that is possible? Do you think that people could develop personal AI to such a level that AGI isn't pursued anymore after that point?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm a huge fan of AI human combinations where the AI is sort of supporting the human in living. And I think that when every human has an AI that supports them, that creates new kinds of networks. And there's certainly all kinds of issues with very powerful AGI. How are they used appropriately? Are they safe, and so on? And I think that probably needs to get governed at a global scale. Because some little group off in the corner doing something dangerous could be very harmful for the world as a whole. And so it's a really interesting question whether a network of personal AIs associated with every citizen in the world might together be able to manage and control the development of AGI and to ensure that it's developed safely. And I totally agree with you that it will lower the need and demand for very powerful AI. If our goal is really to support humanity, other people have other goals, then once every human is, cruising along really well, we don't really need more powerful things. The economic system tends to support growth independent of whether humans are happy or not. And so there's a bit of a tension there that I'm not completely sure how to manage. But that's a really interesting set of questions, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think the set of questions matches the interesting part in the name of this podcast. So I wanted to ask you about your company, which does research that I read on the internet. So Possibility Research. Can you tell us more about the company?
Yeah, I mean, that's primarily a think tank. So I've been working with a number of different companies. I'm the chief scientist of a Korean company called AI Brain. I've been consulting with Facebook recently. I've been working with other groups developing patents. But my own long-term direction is a little bit different than the mainstream of AI. Like right now, machine learning, primarily based on deep learning neural nets, is really the hot area. That's very recent. It was only since around 2012 that line started really succeeding. It has been so successful. And I think ultimately we really need to combine the learning aspects and the sort of soft neural aspects with much more precise modeling. My background, my PhD was half physics, half mathematics. And so I'm a big fan of mathematical thought, mathematical reasoning. I think we really need to bring the kind of precision that you get from mathematics together with the power of learning. And so I've been involved in a long-term project to sort of develop a new kind of AI. And it's at this moment not primarily business oriented. It's primarily sort of technology development, but that may change in the near future. So.
I wanted to ask you on that. So, I mean, if you can disclose it, how exactly were you thinking of combining the sort of the neural networks with the more symbolistic approaches? Because I was thinking about this also, but the problem that I faced as I was kind of developing the idea in my head was that I think the primary reason the expert systems were kind of foreshadowed by these new approaches was because the expert systems were just experts in this one domain, one narrow domain, and the knowledge had to be encoded by a human. So I thought of an approach, well, for example, let's take some neural network, and then before it outputs anything, it could take its input and code it. That is, it could take its output and code it in some logic and check if the output makes sense. But to check if the output makes sense, you need to have like the database that contains the model of the world already, and that is pretty hard, and that's why expert system kind of failed. So I was wondering, like, do you have any? What does your solution look like?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of threads and lots of people, lots of groups working in this area. And I would say it's still not clear the best way forward. I have my own biases and so on. But I can give a sort of a little bit of a sense. The neural nets are doing remarkable things. The most amazing recent system is something called GPT-3, which is a language model. A language model is just something which takes a string of words, say in English, and gives you probabilities for the next word. So really, really simple model. But OpenAI, who built GPT-3, built the world's biggest language model, which has 175 billion weights, so enormous, enormous model. And they trained it on a huge amount of Wikipedia and the web and so on. And the thing is pretty darn good. It can generate English that's indistinguishable by people from human written sentences. So in that way, it's sort of a solution to a kind of Turing test. It can do some logical reasoning. It seems to sort of make sense, but you can very easily ask it things where it gives you nonsense. And so it's by no means, the perfect answer at this point. It's based on a very simple module, something called self-attention, repeated over and over and over again. And there was a very influential essay about a year ago by Rich Sutton, who he's the guy who wrote the top book on reinforcement learning. He called his essay The Bitter Lesson, which was that human AI researchers love to think of clever solutions and to handcraft them and really make them well, like you're saying, in building the expert systems. Or sort of the extreme of that was a project called the Cyc project, CYC, which had teams of, I don't know how many, 50 or so linguists and philosophers, all working very diligently late into the hours of the night, hand building all of human knowledge that they could, all common sense knowledge, and building this enormous system. And, it was very impressive, but it never really worked all that well. Whereas something like GPT-3, the code is maybe 10 pages of code, something like that. It's pretty teeny. They had to run it for a lot of time. People are estimating it's like $5 million worth of compute time to train the thing. But once it was trained, my God, you can ask it all kinds of knowledge. It knows all sorts of knowledge. And so Sutton's essay argues that systematic processes like machine learning and like search will dominate very clever human-written code as compute power gets more powerful. And so that's where you should really focus. If you're thinking about the future, focus on those things which scale with compute power. On the other hand, you look at today's neural nets, and first of all, they're flawed. They have all kinds of wrong knowledge. GPT-3 knows a lot of good stuff, but it also, if you ask it who was president of the United States in the 1600s, it'll give you an answer. And so you can't really trust it because you don't know. It doesn't know what it knows and what it doesn't know, and you have no way of knowing how good the coverage of it is. They're pretty darn inefficient. You have to evaluate every neuron and every input, which is ridiculous. Most of that knowledge has nothing to do with a particular input. And so why on earth do you have to sort of look it up that way? It's not, they don't represent probabilities very precisely. And so it doesn't give you much of a handle on the knowledge that you've got. And so in some ways, they're doing amazing things. They're fantastic. They've been killing it in machine vision, in game playing, playing AlphaGo and so on. In other ways, it's a pretty clearly bad representational model. Logic, on the other hand, that's the foundation of mathematics. We use Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. You can encode all of mathematics in that. You can encode all physics models, which are built out of mathematics. You can encode those. You can encode all engineering models. And so the full body of human knowledge that can be precisely represented can all be represented in Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. We have a theorem proving, simple set of axioms to prove theorems in that. Theorem proving is not very good yet. So theorem proving desperately needs some of the power that machine learning gives you. And there are groups trying to do that. There's been great success with something called satisfiability testing. So general theorem proving has to deal with statements that are quite rich and complex. If all you want to do is find inputs to a circuit that make that circuit true on the output, that's a variant of what's called the satisfiability problem. And in the 90s, there were a series of competitions for doing that better and better. And there's a freely available system called Z3 from Microsoft, which is a really good satisfiability solver. And there's a whole industry now of people converting problems, especially things like in laying out circuits, in solving logistics problems, that kind of thing, converting them into the form that a satisfiability solver can solve, plugging it into something like Z3, and amazingly, it often gives you great results. So that's an example of an early stage of a pure logical-based system, still too simple to capture the richness that we really need, but a systematic mechanism for finding solutions is working really, really well. And so I see the merger of the power of deep learning and the power of logical representations is sort of emerging in that way. One extra little thread that's, I think, well worth considering are what are called probabilistic programming languages. And there are probably about 20 or maybe even 50 of them that are candidates that use precise Bayesian statistics to represent models. And they use very general techniques, especially something called Markov chain Monte Carlo, which allows you to statistically explore a probabilistic model and to get very precise outputs from it. Those are on the verge, I would say, of being able to do both good learning and statistics and do logical reasoning. And some of the most recent probabilistic programming languages allow you to incorporate deep learning neural nets, not as the end result model, but as models that help the search go better. And I think that's a really great use for neural nets, because if you don't get it right, so what? It doesn't matter. You're not messing up with the semantics of what you're doing. You use the power of those learned systems to drive your logical precise systems. And so I think that's where I think the real thing is going to go, eventually.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And to get back on the GPT-3, so I heard, I mean, I'm on Twitter, so I kind of follow people from AI, and the common complaint has been that, exactly as you said, GPT-3 sometimes doesn't really understand what it's saying. That is, it doesn't like it doesn't have what we would call logic in it. Like some of the statements don't make sense, and so one blog post over which you and I corresponded via email essentially says that as you increase the computing power and as you increase the model capabilities, the model at one point is going to start to learn the logic and the world model, because its capabilities are going to be so big that it is going to start learning it, because it learned all of the other stuff prior to it. So what do you think on that? So do you think that that approach, so just kind of like building upon GPT-3 and then GPT-4, GPT-5, and just kind of building up upon it and increasing the compute power, do you think that can also lead us to an AGI or something that's close to an AGI?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. For me, the most remarkable thing, I mean, GPT-3 is pretty amazing to just see what it can generate. But what's really remarkable is to look at GPT-1 and then GPT-2 and then GPT-3 and to see the new capabilities that have come with each step. And so, the GPT-3 model is almost the simplest thing you can imagine. Once you have the idea of this self-attention module, it's basically that self-attention module repeated a whole bunch of times. And yet, it doesn't have anything in it explicit to have it do reasoning. There's no reason to think it should do any reasoning. And yet it can kind of do arithmetic. You can ask GPT-3, what is 27 plus 42? And it'll get it right quite often. And so some of the time that the particular question you ask it was on the web somewhere, and it learned that, it burned it to its weights. And so it's just looking it up. But it appears to also be doing a little bit of reasoning and generalization, which is sort of remarkable. I would love to better understand how it is that this attention mechanism can do that. I think if you explicitly incorporate multi-stage reasoning, and there are a number of people doing that with neural nets now. There's a really great video recently by Chris Manning at Stanford on doing simple reasoning to answer questions about images that I think is really right on in the right direction. And so I think once a general module for multi-stage reasoning together with attention is incorporated into something like a GPT-3, then I think we've got some really powerful answers coming out. Even GPT-3 is pretty amazing. Like, GPT-3 is a pretty good world model. It essentially knows everything that's in Wikipedia. It can't use that knowledge in a multi-stage way by itself, but some people are proposing, don't think of GPT-3 as the AGI, think of it as just a module in something bigger. GPT-3 has no goals. Its training is all about just predicting the next word. If you want to build a real AGI, you've got to have some explicit representation of goals. It's got to take some inputs, and it's got to take those goals and its internal state and use that to choose actions. And so some people are proposing just use GPT-3 as the world model inside of an agent architecture. And I'm sure people are going to try that. And I don't think the current generation is powerful enough to be a full AGI, but I'm guessing it will do some pretty surprising and amazing things. That kind of architecture would allow the system to start doing multi-step things and start, having a memory and learning and reasoning and so on. And so it could very well be that the GPT-3 style system is what leads us into full AGI. It's a little worrisome because it's a very uncontrolled system, right? what it knows and what it's learned are just things off the internet, right? And so it's as happy to believe some weird theory as it is something which is in Wikipedia. And so it'd be probably not such a good idea to base your full AGI on that kind of knowledge. But hey, might happen.
Yeah, that would be pretty reckless to do that. And I think a question that poses itself is, do you think that AGI progress is necessarily going to happen within companies such as OpenAI or DeepMind, that is, companies that are big and that are well funded? Or do you think that individuals can also somehow contribute? For example, when I think about it, I think that one good way to contribute would maybe be to work on interpretability, because interpretability seems, if the world is going in the neural nets direction, then I think it would be useful to kind of interpret the internal representation of the neural networks. So that's kind of one thing where I see an individual outside of a big organization potentially contributing to the AGI safety problem. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that individuals outside of organizations could contribute to AI safety?
Oh, absolutely, totally. But, we're in a state right now where one good idea can totally transform the field. I mean, the whole line of these BERT and GPT and all that, those all came from this self-attention module, which was only introduced in 2017. It's just 3 years old, and it was a group. It happened to be a group at Google, but the idea underneath it could easily have been invented by anybody anywhere. It's interesting to look at where investment is. All the governments around the world realize, Putin came out a few years ago saying the country which leads in AI will lead the world. And so governments are starting to realize, oh my God, this technology is so powerful that we better, it's an actual survival aspect that our country better get good at it. China has very explicitly, they're training their kids and throughout all their school systems in AI, and they're putting a lot of investment into companies. The US has been sort of slower. I mean, I just saw an announcement they're going to up the 30% increase in AI. We're going to do $1 billion, $200 million into AI or something. Meanwhile, I think Google is investing something like $30 billion. So the scales are not quite in sync yet. On the other hand, to do these big computations like this GPT-3, that was $5 million of compute power. Not many individuals can do that. And to really scale that up, some people are saying you'll need another factor of 100 or maybe 1,000 to get up to sort of human level performance there. So we're now talking billions of dollars just to train that kind of model. So that style of compute seems to really benefit the big companies. Strangely, the big companies have mostly been publishing their results and in many cases giving away, like OpenAI gave away GPT-2. And I'm guessing they won't be giving away GPT-3 because I think they have a business model now where they somehow want to make that part of their product offering. But I definitely think that individuals can be empowered, and often very simple AI can make a big difference to a business. So in terms of actually creating an AI-based business, I think there's tons of opportunities. For AI safety, I think they're still primarily at the stage of understanding and new ideas. And so I don't think to really make an impact on AI safety, I don't think you need to work on a huge GPT-3 style system. I think you basically just need to analyze, get a better thing like interpretability. I think that's a great area to think about. And then governability. We also want to keep systems from veering into bad parts of the space. I'm happy that there's so much work going into self-driving cars. I'm actually sort of a self-driving car skeptic because there's so many tail events that a little kid running across the street with a balloon, does the car know about that? And how can we be sure the car knows about that? It doesn't seem like self-driving cars on ordinary human streets is really such a great use case. But I'm glad that they're thinking about it because it brings up a lot of the safety issues in a fairly tractable form. And I think we're really going to need AI based on precise mathematical logic in order to have controllable systems. I suggested something I call the safe AI scaffolding strategy, which is to do safety by having a series of systems where you actually have mathematical proof of safety properties at every stage, and you don't go to the next stage until you have that proof, and you don't launch the next stage until you have a proof about that, and you sort of bootstrap your way up to very powerful systems in that way. So I think that's potentially a good strategy. That one, theorem proving at this moment looks like it's going to require a lot of compute. And so that one, it can probably be executed mostly by large institutions. But the ideas behind it, I think individuals can make a big contribution to.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying your thoughts. And so just to get back on the thing you said, where you said that individuals today have a lot of opportunities in regards to starting a company that relates to AI. Could you maybe like give some examples or some general frameworks for thinking about how could some individual that's not from the US or maybe not even from Europe, so someone's listening to this podcast from some country where the economy isn't as good, and he's trying to start a company, what ideas related to AI would you have in mind?
Well, I mean, so one area I don't know if you're familiar with is software as a service. Sometimes they write it SaaS. And there are lots of examples of little companies that found some niche and were able to make great income, on the order of like $1 million a year kind of thing by finding a niche. Like I think one company I was looking at, it was difficult for podcasters to turn their to make videos sort of advertising their podcasts, and so they set up a simple SaaS, simple software as a service system, which took your podcast and turned it into a nice little video that you could then post somewhere, and people would find your podcast. And they made it so easy and so simple to do, and they had, I think, a monthly fee of $6 a month or something, and I think they were making like $50,000 a month on something like that. And so lots and lots of little niche opportunities there. And now people are starting to realize, oh, you can do AI in that way. And they're doing AI as a service, AIaaS. I don't quite know how to pronounce that. But I think, so there are a lot of little examples of that. One I was just looking at is it's a company that helps other businesses make advertisements on postcards. So they take aspects of those businesses and they print out postcards and deliver them for them. And they were using simple AI to for a real estate company. Oh no, it was for a solar power company. They would take photos of a person's house, estimate, using simple AI, like how big the roof was, how expensive it would be to put solar power on there, how much money they could get back from that solar power, and put all those estimates without anybody having asked them to onto a postcard and sending it to them. And the solar company increased their sales dramatically, and so they were happy to pay this company to do that service. And so that's an example of taking off-the-shelf AI. There are lots and lots of great repos of image recognition, speech recognition, transformation, language stuff, all kinds of stuff. You just find something there, find some niche, and match them, and then put it together in a bundle that really meets somebody else's needs. You can make lots and lots of money doing that.
Yeah, that sounds like really solid advice, because I've been consumed by Twitter as soon as I created an account, and I've been following some of these people, AI safety researchers, as well as other entrepreneurs that have also done software as a service businesses. And essentially, just as you said, those people are making, there's this one guy, I think he's making like $35,000 a month, and he created a software as a service app for some platform. So I think, yeah, it's really viable.
Which is great. I think it's very empowering for the individual. This is probably one of the best times, in history for individuals to be entrepreneurial. And the other thing is you can do it from anywhere. So you can move to there are a whole bunch of nomadic entrepreneurs who just travel around and visit countries they enjoy and work over the web. And so that's a remarkable situation too.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you about your thoughts. So we already kind of discussed personal AI in a little bit near the beginning of the podcast. But what I was focused on is, you said that in about 5 years you will most likely see personal AI becoming becoming real. What do you think its capabilities are going to be? Like, how far will it go in terms of helping you and stuff like that?
I think to understand how it's actually going to arise, we need to sort of look a little bit at what's driving it. So, fancy AI gets most of the headlines. Sophia the robot, or deep fakes doing celebrities in the wrong movie, or whatever. But really, what's driven AI in actual business, what's actually creating business value, are what are called recommender systems. And so companies like Amazon, Netflix, Google all have systems that look at how you act, build models of you, and show you things that you're more likely to like. And that has driven tremendous value in all of these companies. And it's created what many people call the platform business model, where instead of a company providing a service themselves, they act as a middleman, and they hook up producers and consumers. Like Uber doesn't drive taxis themselves. They find a good driver and a good rider, and they hook them up, and they take a percentage in the middle. And so those kinds of companies, and they're driven by recommender engines, figuring out who will benefit from what service. And so that has really led, I think, to the rise of social media, companies like Google, Twitter, Snapchat, and so on. But as these platform companies become powerful, individuals can sort of be at their behest. If a company doesn't like what you've been tweeting, they can kick you off of Twitter, and you don't really have any recourse. If all your friends are on Twitter, that's it. You can't do it. And so in some sense, the companies have become more powerful than the customers. And then in the platform type of model, like Uber has been squeezing the profits of their drivers to the point where some of the drivers can't even afford to make a living. And so there's pressure now to push back against that. And I think of personal AI as an example of that, where instead of you having to sign up for all these different services, for buying things on Amazon, for this and that, your AI can do it for you. And as long as the AI knows what your preferences are, it can sign up for 100 different social media companies and figure out which one is best for whatever it is you want to do. And it can search lots and lots of different marketplaces and find you the best deal. And so that will serve to empower the individual in the face of these larger companies. And so I think there's an economic driver there. And it doesn't have to be complicated AI to begin with. But I think once it's there, and once people get used to having agents that represent them, then there's pressure for those agents to get smarter, to know more about you, to be more trustable. If you're really going to allow this agent to be a proxy for you, it better really represent what you care about, and it better not be hackable by some third party, something like that. So there will be, a lot of effort, I think, in making these personal AIs more trustable, richer semantics, know more about you, and more able to act out in the world. But I think it's an inevitable thing, and I think it will totally shift the dynamics of these networks, because as individuals become more empowered, then let's say an advertiser today may be using manipulative advertising. Let's say they figure out that you're vulnerable to alcohol. So they start showing you alcohol ads about how good alcohol is. And you want to watch your movie, and you can't say, I don't want alcohol ads today. Well, with your personal AI, you could have a contract with the movie provider that says, okay, you can show me an ad, but no alcohol ads, or something like that. And so that then serves as a force that pushes back against advertisers to stop showing you manipulative advertising. And it re-empowers the individual. And so I think that the balance of power, is going to shift as individuals start having AIs working on their behalf.
Yeah, and what you said makes a lot of sense, because essentially what happened before the internet, if you wanted to, let's say, become a singer, what you needed to do is you needed to go to a publishing company and essentially ask them if they wanted to produce your song. And if they said yes, then and only then could you become a singer. Then the internet sort of decentralized that. But now, as you have noted, the platforms like Twitter or iTunes or Facebook are becoming really powerful, and they are essentially becoming the gatekeepers. So this personal AI could kind of be the second internet, so to speak, to kind of alleviate you of everything. But then another question, which I think is pretty interesting, poses itself is, if I have a personal AI that's really me, and let's say that I'm just selfish, I don't even have to be evil. I just, like, in some edge situations, I'm always going to prefer my well-being over somebody else's. Then you get to the question of, okay, well, maybe we should kind of prevent people, or that is, prevent personal AIs from truly representing every single need. But then the question that poses itself after that is, okay, but who determines what is good and what isn't good? And essentially that person or that company has the ultimate power, right? Because they can control like the rules that all of the personal AIs are going to obey. So that's also very, very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a critical issue. I don't think it'll be one entity, maybe for things which are actually dangerous. If somebody is threatening other people's lives, that's something that every country has said that's an illegal thing. And so you've got, police forces and judicial things. And so there will probably be an AI equivalent of that. But I think for just everyday interactions, it'll be my personal AI interacting with your personal AI. And if you start doing obnoxious things, my personal AI say, no, I don't like that guy. I'm not going to interact with you anymore. Or if you're trying to buy something from a certain seller and your reputation is really bad, you've done bad things in the past, that seller may say, sorry, I don't interact with you. And so it'll be a much more fluid thing. And I don't think it has to be a monolithic choice of, okay, we allow this, we don't allow this. It's each entity, each personal AI will be trying to interact with a variety of systems. And those systems will be interacting with the AIs, and there'll be a sort of reputational, truth-based balance that occurs in a large network of interaction. So hopefully that'll be good. I mean, definitely, there are risks there that we're going to have to overcome. But that's sort of how biology went too, right? I mean, if you look at the history of biology, initially it's sort of dog eat dog, right? It's just pure competition. Any energy resources I get means you don't get it. And yet all sorts of mutuality and cooperation have emerged so that today we have complicated ecosystems in which there are some bad actors, but for the most part, organisms are able to interact in a sort of a peaceful, harmonious way with other organisms.
Yeah, that's a very, I think, very accurate description of the world. As I was reading, I'm still reading Charles Darwin's original book on the origin of species. I still haven't read through it yet, but I read one interpretation of the book on Darwin's book. There's a lot of books talking about evolution, so I read one of those. And most recently, I'm reading Anti-Fragility by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and that book also goes into great details about how the fragility of the individual actually contributes to the anti-fragility of the entire system. So even if there are some bad actors, well, most likely they are going to get weeded out because the entire system is anti-fragile. It's going to push it out. So yeah.
Which Darwinian book have you been reading?
I read, I think it was by Robin Wright, The Moral Animal. Robert. Yeah.
He wrote a later book he called Non-Zero, which is one of my favorite books, which is, he thinks of the evolution of biological history and also human history as emerging from non-zero-sum games. From two actors working together, they create more value than they could separately. And that drives the kinds of cooperation that we've seen. And I think that's going to be a very important force in AI going forward. How do separate AIs interact? It's going to be non-zero-sum games where people are working to create value out of nothing, basically.
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I was inspired. I was listening to a podcast by Naval Ravikant, and he talked about how when you're learning something, you should always start with the basics. And then he mentioned that example, like he's mentioned that he has a lot of friends that have read hundreds of books on evolution but have never read the original, and I was like, I'm one of these people, although I only read one book. So I decided, yeah, probably a good idea to read the fundamentals first and then kind of the interpretations later on.
In the United States, there's a college called St. John's College, where the students going there, they want to learn calculus, instead of reading a modern calculus text, they read Newton. And so the cool thing about that is they really get the sense of what the questions were in the struggle. The bad thing is they may not get the modern understanding, and sometimes the original people, missed certain things. So I think it's good to do both. But I applaud you for reading Darwin. That book is, and his later one, his second one, Moral Sentiments, I forget what it's called, are packed with knowledge and insights that I think haven't been fully unpacked even to this day.
Yeah, I still have a lot to go in that book, but hopefully I'll get there. So we talked about sort of the path to AGI. Again, we kind of keep jumping from topic to topic because it's kind of a dynamic conversation. But we talked about GPT-3. So I wanted to ask you about what are your thoughts on the future of artificial general intelligence? Are you doom and gloom about it, or do you think? So let's maybe pose the question like this: if everything was the way it is now, so all the kind of AI research power is within Google DeepMind and OpenAI, and nothing significant happens to the structure of researchers, would you kind of be confident that the final outcome of when we actually build the AGI is going to be beneficial to humanity? Would you kind of be skeptical? I mean, I know I'm asking a question that Nassim Nicholas Taleb would condone because we can't really predict the future. But I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the good news is that all of those companies you mentioned are very aware of the issues. So one of the early papers I wrote in this area is something called the Basic AI Needs, which argued that if you don't specify goals very, very carefully, they tend to have sub-goals which can be harmful. And at the time, it was really hard to get people to understand that message. Fortunately, it seems to have spread, and people seem to be aware of it. And so there's actually quite a few groups now, Future of Life Institute, Future of Humanity Institute, who are very focused on trying to deal with these questions. I haven't seen great answers yet. Like, I would love to see a systematic procedure for, if this is your goal, here's how to write it for an AGI to achieve that goal without causing other problems. And the part that's maybe makes me a little pessimistic is I haven't seen clear ways of doing that yet. On the other hand, the fact that so many people are now aware of those issues and concerned about it. Just this morning, I got there was a venture capital fund sending around their AI guidelines to ensure that they don't want to contribute to doing something bad. So it's like, great, more power to them. And so I think the setup is good for it. I would say we don't really know how hard the problem is. That it's easy to see that if you don't do anything, that could be bad. It may be that fairly simple things, like the particular approach I would like to take, which is using mathematical proof as your sort of hard barrier, as long if you built up an infrastructure so that you never run something that doesn't have a proof of good behavior, I think that could be a pretty simple way to move forward. Of course, we're dealing with people all over the world, and making sure that all actors are good is certainly a challenge. So there's complicated both technical challenges and then also social and political challenges. But I tend to be an optimist, and I think things like I like Taleb's anti-fragility. I think the world and the structure of humanity is much more anti-fragile than we tend to think. And so as people build things, if somebody makes a mistake, I think that there will be feedback forces that will pretty rapidly sort of tend to correct it.
Yeah, and I want to get back on your basic AI drives because this is essentially how we started our communication. Because the first email I sent you, I kind of misunderstood it. And what I didn't understand, that is my original question to you, was how is the machine going to have a self-preservation instinct, which is one of its basic drives, if it didn't undergo the process of evolution? And essentially what you said, And I think that the answer holds. If you think about it, it makes sense. Is essentially this machine is going to is going to be able to see world states in the future, and it's going to see a future where it's shut off, and in that future it can no longer act on the world, so it's going to act in order to prevent that possible future outcome. It's going to take those actions. Now, if I understood that correctly, that means that it's going to self-persevere, but also that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to act against humans. So only if the agent sees that the humans are going to shut it off, and that, for example, the only way is to kill a human, then yeah, it's probably going to kill a human to self-persevere itself. However, if, for example, it can either, let's say, shut a metal door that the human can't open or kill a human, then it's, let's say, equally likely to choose one of the two actions, but the main goal of the agent will be to persevere itself, not to get shut down. So essentially what you're saying in your paper is, okay, the agent is going to have a self-preservation instinct, but from my interpretation of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to kill people. It just means that it will prevent people from shutting it off. And we don't know if that's going to entail killing people. It may or may not.
Yeah, and so I think you got it exactly right. But that's for a system with a really simplistic goal. So like the example I use in that paper is a chess playing machine. So if you just build an AGI with the goal of play good chess, then everything else in the world is less important to it than playing good chess. And it doesn't know anything about murder being bad or whatever. And so if killing somebody is a good way, on the other hand, if it really understands the world, if the machine is killing somebody, that's going to bring the heat of all the world's military down upon it. And so that's not a very good strategy for a truly intelligent agent. And saying play good chess is a terrible goal. It's too simple. It doesn't incorporate the place of that system within the larger network of humanity and of other systems. And I think we would place, in any truly AGI system, hopefully we put the benefit to humanity as one of its highest goals, if not its highest goal. And so exactly how that plays out, though, there's lots and lots of subtle philosophical questions. Like, so I posed years ago the question of, can you reliably get a machine to turn itself off? And the trouble is, turning yourself off is a very dramatic move that, unless you have really high confidence you're going to get turned back on again, you want to be really, really sure that conditions are the way you think they are. So like, you could say, okay, machine, your job is to play chess for the next 4 days, and at the end of 4 days, turn yourself off. Well, imagine that moment just before the 4 days. It'll say, has it really been 4 days? What if my clock isn't right? What's the probability that my clock is wrong? And do they really mean that I should be shutting it off? Maybe I should make a backup system that runs in the corner over there just in case it's wrong. So there's lots and lots of little sneaky side things that maybe the designer of the goal system didn't think about. And so I think those are where a lot of the subtleties are going. Stuart Russell has a funny way of summarizing the issue, which is you can't serve the coffee if you're dead. So if you have a robot butler whose one job in life is to serve coffee, being turned off means it's not serving coffee. And so it's going to resist that unless the goal system were carefully designed. And how to design those goal systems is something I'm hoping there will be, maybe there is. I haven't been tracking that literature very closely. And so, but fortunately, there are a lot of very smart people thinking about that kind of question now. And some of the game systems are starting to show that behavior. You tell it it's supposed to win the game, but it can find some way of doing the wrong thing, apparently losing the game, but the measure of what winning is ends up being rewarded, and so it does, it discovers strange things. Some of the game players simulate a PC, and they find that in the simulated world, by changing the size of the window repeatedly, they can get things to do crazy stuff that's sort of outside the normal rules. And we should expect that AGI systems especially are going to use whatever knobs they can find. And so we better prepare for that.
Yeah, there's a really good book by Stuart Russell, Human Compatible. I don't know if you read it, but essentially it talks about how the current systems where we have a goal, which is represented as, for example, let's say maximize the score, are inherently flawed, and that we should look for other machine learning sort of frameworks, so to speak. And he mentions then later on in the book, he goes on and explains his inverse reinforcement learning or inverse reward learning. I'm not sure what it is exactly, methodology, how it's named. But yeah, those are some things that he explores in the book. And it's kind of, he doesn't like offer the solution to it, but he definitely invests some thought into it. I should revisit that book. I think I read it 2 years ago or something like that, or 1 year ago. I don't really remember.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've dipped into it, but I would like to read it more carefully as well. I'm a big fan of it. It's inverse reinforcement learning. And Stuart and some of his students introduced that about 20 years ago. And it's a great idea that you observe how somebody behaves. And from that, you can figure out what they're trying to accomplish. And that lets you maybe create more nuanced goals than the handwritten goals. And so, of course, you also need to pair that with provable properties, I believe, to ensure that the goal that you have induced really captures all the characteristics that you want.
yeah, and as we're on the topic, do you think that in the book Superintelligence, Nick Bostrom talks about how the biggest challenge for mathematicians, in particular mathematicians, is going to be formalizing concepts such as love and kindness and, let's say, care for others. Because when he was writing the book, he thought about, okay, if we want an AGI with a goal, for example, let's say make all humanity make all of the humans in the world have a very big sense of well-being, then that should be formalized mathematically. So you mentioned that you have a PhD in physics and slash math. Do you think that that is possible? Do you think that we could mathematically formalize stuff such as care for other people, love, altruism, or do we need foundationally different frameworks, as Stuart Russell suggests?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I tend to be in questions about consciousness and love and emotion and so on, tend to focus more on what actual actions it leads to. And so instead of thinking about what is love in the abstract, I think it's easier to precisely specify what actions are loving. So if you really, love somebody, what things do you do? And some, clearly things which help them are good. But sometimes it's more loving to allow somebody to go through their own struggle than it is to sort of do something for them. So we have, subtleties in that way. And I think, to the extent that a person can clearly say, yeah, that's a loving action, no, that's not a loving action, then I think that's easy to formalize. In fact, GPT-3 captures a lot of that kind of thing. The challenge is there are many quandaries and philosophical challenges where humans don't know what we should be doing, right? So I don't know if you've looked at the trolley problems. It's sort of like a little mini thought experiment for ethical philosophers where, a trolley is going to kill some people and you can either choose to put it on another track where it'll kill some other people or not. And so is it moral to save 5 people in return for killing 1 person? Is it better to kill an older person than a younger and save a younger person? Those kinds of questions. And people struggle with that. And I would say there's no universal agreement on what's true. But to the extent that we can figure out what is it that we're trying to achieve, then I think we can use that to help in solving moral quandaries. The challenge is philosophers have been thinking about this for thousands of years, and they've made great progress. There's some really good insights. But AGI is probably coming in, I don't know, a few decades maybe, or sooner. We're going to have to encode something in there. I guess my safe AI scaffolding approach would be let's start with very limited AGIs that don't have a lot of efficacy in the world, and then have them help us figure out situations that are on the edge that we have to sort of get more clarity about, so that we sort of use the emerging AGI to help us build the more powerful one.
Do you think that we could, for example, as humanity, or let's say just AI researchers, do you think that they could convince people that AGI is a potential threat to humanity? Do you think that that is possible? So let's say in 5 years, there's some AI breakthrough and we get closer to AGI, and that at one point people just say, or take GPT-3, do you think that it's possible for AI researchers to kind of influence policymakers and decision makers in countries across the world to kind of put a brake on AI research? Do you think it's possible to regulate it in a way?
That's a really tricky issue. People, I think, are predisposed to be worried about AI. Anyway, they don't need AI researchers telling them to be worried. They're worried, right? They've seen the Terminator movies and all that. It's more, well, what is their response? They tend to sort of get freaked out, and then, like right now, there's many countries are banning face recognition. And, yeah, there are ways you can abuse face recognition. Face recognition is incredibly useful for a society in many ways. And so they tend to respond in a really shallow way that doesn't solve the problem and which prevents a lot of really good things from happening. So I think that's more the risk. I actually think too much worry and fear is probably not a good thing. And so, like, Stuart, I think, was involved in that Slaughterbots video. I don't know if you've seen that one, where it's a powerful video, well worth watching. They visualize little teeny drones with an explosive charge in them that can, with face recognition, that can target an individual person and then go near their head and basically kill them. And so it's basically little assassination bots, and you could, like, if you're a member of a certain political party, you could send out your swarm and basically kill off anybody who's not a member of that party. That kind of fearful thing. And it's a pretty chilling, scary video. Just look up Slaughterbots, which in some ways was really good at getting people to think about that. In other ways, it's a really scary video that doesn't necessarily have people thinking in a careful, thoughtful way about what's the best way forward. And so, and the economic value of AI is likely to be so huge that I don't think there's any turning the clock back. So I don't think that's a viable solution at all. I think we need to move it forward in a careful and positive way. And I think it definitely needs to be regulated. There probably will need to be governing bodies which sort of validate that, yeah, this is an okay AI to allow on the internet, that kind of thing. How we get from where we are to there, especially given that different countries are probably going to be battling one another. China, US is probably the most visible of those. So I think there's some political challenges, definitely. And exactly what the right way of thinking about it, I think something which is too negative and too fearful probably will backfire. Something which is too Pollyannish, oh, there's nothing to worry about, that's probably not good either. So, where we are today, where most AI researchers have some sense of, oh yeah, there's some risks, and there's some smart people thinking about it. We don't quite have the solutions yet. That's probably a healthy place to be, I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wanted to now ask you about the next steps, both for AGI and for personal AI. So what do you think are kind of like literally like the next step on the ladder towards AGI and personal AI? And the reason why I'm asking you for both is because maybe they're the same step. So if you could like contrast those.
Yeah, well, I see, the vision I have for personal AI doesn't really exist at all. There are systems like Alexa, Amazon Alexa, which is a sort of personal information agent. And, she knows a little bit about you. She really doesn't know what you care about or whatever. And so I would think of Amazon Alexa as an agent for Amazon that sits in my house and helps my life. I have it, and I ask her what the time is all the time and what's the weather and, that kind of stuff. I'm happy to have it. I like it. Amazon gets some benefit. They remind me that maybe I should reorder more coffee or something like that. And I'm happy to allow them to do that. So for me, I feel like it's a win-win relationship, but I would definitely not trust that agent with, deep personal knowledge or anything like that. And so I don't think we're in the zone yet. I don't think AI is quite where it needs to be. Like even the issue of trustable AI, to have an agent that I'm going to trust, posting for me on social media sites, I better really trust it. And I think for that, we're going to need more of like what you were saying, which is interpretable AI. And I'm very happy that people are starting to think about that. I would actually like to have AI, which is like, I think having these huge machine learned systems like GPT-3 is a great starting point. I don't think you want to deploy those systems directly. I think you want to build much more controlled systems, maybe built on Bayesian probabilistic modeling. I mean, that's the candidate I think I'm happiest with at the moment. And there's starting to be some pretty good, like MIT has this system called Gen. Uber just fired their whole AI department. I guess Uber's not doing well with this COVID thing, but they have some great systems. And so they have a probabilistic programming language called Pyro that really naturally integrates with deep learning systems. So that was a nice candidate. TensorFlow has TensorFlow probability, and I think PyTorch has a probability version. So the probability side of things seems to be, it's not quite as popular as the neural net side of things, but I think it's coming up, and I think the synthesis of those two is doing well, and hopefully the logic-based things will also get in there, and we'll have a sort of full synthesis that will really enable us to make understandable, governable, much more controlled systems than today's systems.
And so related to that, what do you think is the ideal educational background for some AI researcher? Because it seems that these things they are covered by computer science curriculum, but also they're pretty math heavy. So they kind of require a dual degrees, like from computer science and math. But probably maybe they require something else as well. For example, neural nets, probably you could use some background in biology. Not so much because it's mostly math. Backpropagation isn't really present in biology as far as I know. Like backpropagation in its true sense mathematically. But I was just wondering, like, what do you think are the educational prerequisites if somebody wanted to contribute significantly to the area of AI research?
Well, DeepMind, which has been doing, I think, some of the best work, they're very committed to the idea that biology has a lot of answers and it serves as an inspiration. And I think they very explicitly use what's known about biological brains in their systems. I have sympathy for that attitude. I don't think that's going to be the primary driver. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe they're absolutely right. Mathematics, on the other hand, oh my God. So I love mathematics and did a lot. My physics PhD was all based on something called symplectic geometry, which is I thought a fairly esoteric branch of differential geometry, which is very useful in physics, but I didn't imagine that it would be very useful in other areas. Differential geometry turned out to be great for me. One of my first machine learning things was something I call manifold learning, which is to discover the structure of complicated surfaces in large dimensional spaces. We built a lip reading system from that, and a whole bunch of things emerged from that. So having that mathematics background was really, really helpful. As I've been studying Markov chain Monte Carlo, turns out one of the best approaches to that is something called Hamiltonian Markov chains, which is all based on symplectic geometry. And so, they often don't use that language. But one of the amazing things about mathematics is that even topics which seem very remote from practicality have repeatedly turned out to be really, really valuable. And so learning as much mathematics as you can, I would say, is really valuable. Computer science curriculum, at least as of a number of years ago, didn't even teach calculus, or calculus wasn't required. Whereas for things like backpropagation, understanding how derivatives work is like really, really critical. And I think geometry is really critical. And there's a fairly esoteric area of mathematics called category theory. in the elements of category theory are whole other areas of mathematics. And it was only introduced in the, maybe 1940s or something. And mathematicians even viewed it with suspicion. They would call it abstract nonsense. But it has served to really organize and synthesize mathematics. And computer scientists have recently taken it on, and category theory is now a central way of thinking in computer science, and it's starting to make its way into AI and statistics and some of those fields. And so even the very most abstract mathematical ideas, I think it's very valuable to at least understand the basics of, because in some sense, what we're trying to do in AI is rethink the foundations of thought, rethink the foundations of knowledge. And mathematics is the most precise representation of knowledge and thought that we have today. And so seeing what has worked in mathematics and bringing that over into AI, I think is very, very powerful. And I think it's likely to continue being a source of inspiration. So.
And while we're on that topic as well, how would you approach learning math for someone who didn't go through a mathematics university? So, for example, I minored. I'm not really familiar with the United States terms, but essentially, I got my bachelor's degree in information systems, and then I got my master's degree in computer science. So I didn't go through. I mean, I had math courses, but I never went through a bachelor's degree in mathematics and master's degree or a PhD in math. So if you were kind of like self-learning, for example, while you're working a job, how would you do it?
Good question. I mean, the great thing is that Wikipedia is actually pretty good at mathematics. So for almost any topic you want to know about, there's a Wikipedia article on it, and you get some sense of it. Part of the challenge, mathematics has become so vast and so complicated, and if you don't see the forest for the trees, it's hard to sort of keep track of it. So a good way to proceed, I would say, is to find some topic you really care about. Say, deep learning neural nets, maybe you get excited by generative adversarial nets, GANs, G-A-N, which are doing all kinds of amazing, really fun things. Like they're the basis for a lot of the deep fakes things and for generating, fake images, that kind of stuff. They're really interesting. And yet the mathematics underlying them is kind of tricky and complicated. And so, maybe pick something like that and look at the code so you get a sense of what it actually is, and then start delving backwards into, what makes it work. And then you can look up topics in Wikipedia to understand, okay, it's like game theory, and they're talking about Nash equilibrium. What is that? And so you sort of get that topic. And so in that way, you can sort of start with something you care about and use that as a motivator to sort of branch out into neighboring topics. And fortunately, lots of people are now starting to write blog posts where as they understand something, they try and write an intuitive explanation of it. And a lot of those are pretty good. Of course, some of them aren't exactly right. So you have to sort of always balance getting the intuition and also getting the actual deep knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elaborating that. So I think we sort of reached the end of the podcast. Before I finish the recording, would you maybe have some parting thoughts on any of the topics that we discussed, or maybe something you'd like to say that we didn't discuss in this episode?
Sure. Yeah, I'm really glad to talk with you because my sense is that you're very thoughtful and very concerned and sort of pursuing, a really good path forward. And my sense in talking to a lot of people who are, getting into this field, that's sort of the way many people are in that position. And I think that's a very hopeful thing for the future. And the resources that are available, oh my goodness, so much material is freely available on the web that it's possible, I think, to ramp up very quickly and to earn money and to make a big impact. And so I'm very optimistic both for the field and for the people who are in the field at the moment. So
amazing.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this is a very optimistic way to end the podcast. So I'm going to finish the recording. Thank you, listeners or watchers, for listening or watching, and I will see you in the next podcast episode.